This lesson, we're going to be disproving the documentary hypothesis and the JEDP theory.
Look at what they are, why they're false linguistically, other cases of authors switching between names, why they're false biblically, compare the Pentateuch with First Enoch, look at the easy plausibility of Mosaic authorship, and finally the importance of it. Well, what are they? They're the idea that the Pentateuch, aka the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, weren't written by Moses, but were written variously by at least 4 other men and compiled together like a gospel harmony about 1,000 years later. And if you don't know, gospel harmony is where you take the 4 gospel accounts and try to make one document out of them. It's basically the idea what they think the Pentateuch is. Got Questions says that they're based on the fact that different names for God are used in different portions of the Pentateuch, and there are detectable differences in linguistic/literary style. So basically, the entire foundation of it is that you see both the existing one, which is what that means in English, and the Hebrew word for God, both used to refer to God, as well as seeing both narrative writing and civic law writings, and as well as just general alteration of phrasing, like how you're taught to do in school, not say the same thing over and over again. It's basically the entire foundation of this. And by the way, there is no evidence that J, E, D, and P, which are all letter representations of these supposed 4 various authors, them or any other proposed author, or any documents that could have been used to compile together and formulate the 5 books, no evidence that any such things ever existed. The very idea of them does not exist outside of the theory, and they're entirely faceless and nameless men with no narrative to them whatsoever, unlike Moses, who has a name, time period, and entire narrative written about him, his entire life. And so therefore these men and their supposed documents are nothing more than pure speculation. Here's an image to help you see what I'm talking about when I'm describing this theory. So why are they false linguistically? Well, first, using different names to refer to somebody doesn't mean different authors. Consider, I can write a book about a friend and then switch around between using his legal name and using his nickname. Say I had an imaginary friend named Robert who went by Bob and I was writing his biography. I can write about from his birth to him being a toddler, only ever calling him Robert, and then write about his life from age 4 to age 10, calling him Robert Bob or merely Bob. I don't have to be 2 different authors to do that. Second, one person can use multiple linguistic styles, especially with different kinds of text. The Pentateuch is not one whole genre of text. There is narrative, there is poetic writing, and there is legal writing. Also, that's what we're told to do in schools anyways. We're told to never write like the same way every time. We're told, like, don't use the same word repeatedly, use synonyms, don't use the same phrases all the time, switch it around. So why can't Moses do that? And thirdly, David mainly uses Jehovah in Psalm 14, but replaces it entirely with Elohim in his near carbon copy Psalm 53. If you look, that's what Psalm 14 says, and then look at what Psalm 53 says. Same thing, but he switched the names. And go compare the entire Psalms if you don't believe me. See, David and some of the prophets, like especially Isaiah and also Zechariah, they never used one term or name for God constantly. They were always switching around usage between calling God Jehovah or Elohim or a phrase like the Holy One of Israel or so forth. They never just like always used Jehovah or always used Elohim or used it for like so many lines or verses and then switched or so forth. No. So why can't Moses do this? Let's look at some other cases of authors switching between names, because those aren't even all of them. You see, Paul in Galatians 2, he calls Peter by Peter in verses 2 and 8, and also calls him Peter back in chapter 1. But in verses 9, 11, and 14, he calls him Cephas. And Daniel, in chapter 9, randomly changes between saying existing one, Elohim, just Lord in English, and combinations of the two, side by side. And there are just so many other examples of just authors switching between what they're referring to somebody as. And so, yeah, now let's look at why they're false biblically. Jesus names Moses the author in the first part of Mark 12:26 and in John 5:46. Also, Peter and Paul, the leading apostle to the Jews and the leading apostle to the Gentiles, respectively, also refer to Moses as the author in Acts 3:22 and Romans 10:5, respectively. And overall, there are at least around 79 New Testament references to Moses, meaning he was definitely viewed as being real and he was definitely influential. Let's contrast the Pentateuch with First Enoch, or what most people know as simply Enoch, because people say, well, Jude quotes from First Enoch, and we know he's just saying Enoch because that's just kind of what the tradition is. So why can't it be the same with the Pentateuch, where, that's the attributed author, but is known to not really be him? Well, they don't really compare, because First Enoch was known to not truly be authored by Noah's great-grandpa because it was written in Aramaic during the post-exile time of when ancient biblical figures had pseudepigrapha writings, meaning basically they were historical fictions written about them as if they were the ones writing it themselves. There's a lot of that going on during the post-exile, and that was well known about. So that's why First Enoch was never considered scripture and divinely inspired. Also, there are discovered fragments of separate documents that would have been compiled and are dated. So, like, we have actual physical proof that Enoch was a compilation of various documents, like they say the Pentateuch is. And it's only ever written once that Enoch prophesied. And that's in that quote from Jude. The only thing that says Enoch said or whatever, which has a kernel of truth to it. That's why it was written. And, to say that single quote couldn't have been passed down through oral tradition and kept on file somewhere is totally plausible. But when you look at the Pentateuch, it can be found in Hebrew and contains Enoch himself, the person. So it was definitely written pre-exile, because you have to establish Enoch, the person, before then, and most things written in Hebrew were written prior. Also, it has a long tradition of actual Mosaic authorship, starting from at least David, because during the times of the kings of Israel, like in 1 Kings 2:3, you have David himself speaking of the law of Moses, so it already existed up to that point. And in Psalm 1:3, which is one of David's psalms, you have him talking about Moses himself in the events of the Pentateuch. So obviously it was known about at least by David's time. And we now established that David is a real person. So these are probably real facts about him knowing of Moses. Also, there are no precursor documents or fragments that would be able to prove that the Pentateuch was a compilation, unlike with Enoch. And, it has always been viewed as scripture and divinely inspired. And also, Moses is said multiple times in multiple books by multiple people to have commanded or wrote and called, something. So a lot more establishment, attributions of his authorship. There are actually at least 32, probably more, attributions of Moses as the author of the Pentateuch. Let's look at the easy plausibility of Moses writing the Pentateuch. First of all, he was a real person, because the Transfiguration of Jesus event describes him physically appearing, and there's undeniable evidence of a person matching his description living in those areas during those times. There is admitted of a Moses-like figure existing in history, and who's more Moses-like than Moses? Also, for Moses to know all the things that he wrote about, well, for Genesis, all the events could have been passed from, going back to the latest event, passed from God to Adam, to Methuselah / Lamech, to Shem, to Isaac, to Levi, to Moses. So Moses was, and Moses was alive for the rest of it. So Moses either witnessed those things or heard it from another eyewitness or a short chain back to an original eyewitness. And this is no way a telephone game problem. It's a very short chain. Also, he would have learned to write, and specifically in an Egyptian scribe style, which can explain the lack of naming pharaohs because Egyptian scribes didn't name foreign kings. Also supporting the author having learned to write from Egyptians is because the author uses many Egyptian terms, like six of them that he used in Exodus 2:3, that have an Egyptian and no Hebrew origin. And there are many other Egyptian terms used like that as well. Also, his statements about Egypt, like its topography in Genesis 13:10, and such accurate and detailed descriptions of the events that went on in Exodus that are, according to archaeology, true, essentially demand a first-hand witness. Not only did he learn how to write from Egyptians, he must have been there. And who was there? Moses. So Hebrew is definitely an old enough language for Moses to have written it back then. And some will say, well, the author said there were camels during Abraham's time, but camels were in Egypt during that time. Well, there's no for sure evidence that camels were never in Egypt during Abraham's time, and Egypt doubtlessly had access to them due to camel hair rope and camel depicting works found in Egypt that predate Abraham. Also, people say, well, what did the author say in Genesis 36 before any king reigned over the Israelites, if the author isn't writing from when there are kings in Israel? Well, Moses could have written that because he wrote in Genesis 35 and in Deuteronomy 17 that God said Israel will have a king. So obviously he's expecting it to happen. So it's writing from that perspective. And some will say, well, why in Genesis 12 did the author write at that time the Canaanites were in the land? Doesn't that imply it's being written from when they aren't? Well, no, because it's like me saying at that time the English were in the land when talking about 1600s North America to show that I'm talking of a time post their arrival. In no way has to mean that I'm saying there are no English people at this time. So Moses could have easily wrote that to specify this is after Canaanites were in Canaan after Babel. And then some will say, well, why did he talk about gates in the land of Canaan that didn't exist? Well, the Hebrew word shown that's translated as gates can be just an entrance or physically or not physically outlined area, not an actual literal gate, like in Exodus 32 when Moses went through the metaphorical gate. And I say, well, how are Philistines in the land during Abraham's time? Well, Philistines have a very generic name. It just means sea people. And they were a very loosely inter-associated people group. Subgroups didn't really associate much with each other, which is why Philistia was a five-state confederacy with no centralized power at all during the kings of Israel. So there could have easily been people called Philistines pre-Moses for him to write about. And I say, well, what about the alternative versions of the same events? Like the two creation myths and the two times Sarah didn't say she was Abraham's wife. Well, it's been long refuted that Genesis 1 and 2 are not actually two creation myths. Genesis 1 is an overarching telling of the 6 days of creation, and Genesis 2 is the telling of the 7th day and the creation of man during day 6, because it has its own theological and historical significance. And it would be, from a literary standpoint, ridiculous to cram Genesis 2 within Genesis 1. So they're not two creation myths. This has long been established. Also, Sarah not saying that she's Abraham's wife, happening on 2 occasions, makes total sense, because if you did it once, why wouldn't you do it twice? Now let's look at the importance of Moses' authorship. The Pentateuch is the literary foundation of the rest of the Old Testament, which is the literary foundation of the New Testament. 123 New Testament quotes/references come from the Pentateuch. 35 from Genesis, 31 from Exodus, 13 from Leviticus, and 44 from Deuteronomy. Those 4 books are the 3rd to 6th most quoted/referenced Old Testament books in the New Testament. So what is written in them obviously has a great deal of impact on what is written about in the New Testament. And this is an issue of God's authority. It is taking him at his word for who wrote the Pentateuch. It's again, Jesus himself refers to Moses as the author, or believe it was written by men with no evidence of existing. And this isn't like Hebrews, where nobody really knows who wrote it because no name is attributed to it in history. No, this is God himself said it. Israelites, Jews, Christians have been saying for millennia, Moses wrote it, and then all of a sudden this guy comes around and says, he actually didn't. It's these 4 guys who I can't prove existed. And you're going to take that guy at his word for it. Where does it end?